The autumn evening was drawing to a close as the respected federal judge gathered his belongings from his chambers. The courthouse had nearly emptied, with only the gentle hum of the cleaning staff's vacuum cleaners echoing through the marble hallways. He straightened his tie in the reflection of his office window, taking one last look at the stack of cases he'd tackled that day, each one representing real people with real problems who had stood before him seeking justice. Just that morning, he had presided over a case that touched him deeply, a family fighting to keep their home after falling in hard times. The way their eyes had lit up when he found a legal solution to help them. These were the moments that reminded him why he had chosen this path 25 years ago, starting as a public defender in the very same courthouse where he now served as a judge. The keys to his new Mercedes felt heavy in his pocket. The car was more than just a luxury purchase. It represented decades of hard work, countless late nights poring over law books, and the long journey from his childhood in a modest neighborhood to his position on the federal bench. He had picked up the Silver Beauty just last weekend, and even now, a week later, he couldn't help but smile every time he approached it in the parking lot. The security guard at the courthouse entrance waved goodbye with a familiar nod. "Another late night, Your Honor," he called out with a warm smile. The judge waved back, adjusting his grip on his leather briefcase. The evening air had that perfect crispness that made the city feel alive, even as the sun dipped behind the skyline. As he walked to his car, he pulled out his phone to check a message from his daughter. She had just aced her law school admissions test. His chest swelled with pride. The moment felt perfect. His new car, his daughter following in his footsteps, the satisfying weight of another day serving justice. He had scheduled a small family dinner this weekend to celebrate both her achievement and his recent car purchase. The street lights were just flickering to life as he eased the Mercedes out of the judicial parking complex. The leather seats still had that new car smell, and the engine purred quietly as he merged into the light evening traffic. He took the scenic route home, enjoying the way the dashboard lights gleamed against the polished interior. The city looked different from behind the wheel of this car. Not better, just different. He thought about how far he'd come from the days when he used to take 3 buses to get to law school. The car's Bluetooth system softly played his favorite jazz playlist, the same music he'd listened to during those long study sessions in law school. As he stopped at a red light, he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. It was a familiar sight. He had worked with many fine officers over his years on the bench. The light turned green, and he continued his drive, mentally planning tomorrow's docket. Little did he know that this peaceful evening drive, this moment of quiet satisfaction with his life's accomplishments, was about to turn into something entirely different. The blue and red lights that suddenly flashed behind him would mark the beginning of an incident that would not only change his life, but would spark a conversation that his entire city needed to have. The police cruiser had been following him for the last 3 blocks. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another car sharing his route home. But as the lights came on and the siren chirped, reality slowly sank in. He was being pulled over. The same man who had spent decades upholding the law was about to face an encounter that would test his faith in the very system he served. The red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, casting eerie shadows across the car's interior. With the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, the judge eased his new Mercedes to the curb, positioning it perfectly between 2 streetlights. His hands moved deliberately to the steering wheel, resting at 10 and 2, a position he always taught his daughter was safest, both for driving and for police encounters. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach. Even in the growing darkness, he could make out the officer's tense posture, one hand hovering near his weapon. 20 years on the bench had taught him to read body language, and everything about this officer's approach spoke of suspicion rather than routine procedure. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer called out, his voice carrying that edge of authority that the judge had heard countless times in his courtroom. The beam from the officer's flashlight swept across the car's interior, lingering on the judge's hands, then his face, then back to his hands. The luxury car's window hummed smoothly as it descended. The judge could smell the autumn leaves mixing with the exhaust from passing cars, could hear distant sirens somewhere in the city. All those small details that seem to sharpen when adrenaline kicks in. "Good evening, officer," he said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not returning the greeting. His flashlight beam never wavered. "And I'm going to need you to explain how you came to be driving this vehicle." The judge felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but a deep, tired recognition. He'd heard similar stories in his chambers, during coffee breaks with colleagues, at community meetings. Now here he was, living it. "The vehicle is mine, officer. I purchased it last weekend. All the paperwork is in order." Another police car pulled up behind the first, its lights also flashing. The judge noticed curtains twitching in nearby houses, witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. He thought about all the cases he'd presided over, all the testimonies he'd heard about moments exactly like this one. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, taking a step back to make room. The judge noticed the officer's partner was now approaching from the passenger side, creating what they called in law enforcement a tactical advantage. As he carefully opened his door, the judge felt the evening breeze against his face. His suit jacket, the same one he'd worn while delivering 3 verdicts that morning, caught slightly on the seatbelt. The irony wasn't lost on him. 12 hours ago, he'd have been the highest authority in his courtroom. Now, on this darkening street, he was being treated like a suspect. "This is a new Mercedes," the first officer stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. "These vehicles are frequently targeted for theft in this area. You understand why we need to verify ownership." The judge stood calmly, his courthouse parking permit clearly visible through the windshield, his judicial badge still clipped to his belt where he'd forgotten to remove it after work. He wondered if the officer would notice it, or if the assumptions already made would blind him to these details. "I'm going to need to see additional identification," the officer continued, now joined by his partner. Both officers maintained what they would later describe in reports as a safe distance, though to anyone watching from those nearby houses, it might have looked more like an intimidation tactic. The moment stretched out, heavy with unspoken words and centuries of history. The judge thought about his daughter's law school dreams, about the cases waiting on his desk for tomorrow, about the countless similar scenes playing out across the country that very night. He knew the next few minutes would matter, not just for him, but for every story that would be told about what happened here. Standing there in his court suit, beside his legally purchased luxury car, under the harsh glare of police spotlights, he made a decision about how this encounter would proceed. Because sometimes, he knew, the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's dignity. The chilly night air wrapped around them as the judge stood beside his car, the 2 officers maintaining their positions on either side. The beam of the flashlight continued its steady inspection, moving from his face to his clothes, then back again. Traffic slowed as passing cars rubbernecked at the scene. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit, surrounded by police beside a brand-new Mercedes. "Sir, you still haven't explained to my satisfaction how you came to possess this vehicle," the first officer pressed, his tone carrying that edge of authority that seemed to demand submission rather than cooperation. The judge had heard that tone before, but usually from the other side of his bench, often in cases that made him shake his head at the unnecessary escalation of simple situations. "Officer," the judge began, his voice carrying the same measured calm he used in his courtroom, "I have provided you with my license, registration, and proof of insurance. All the documents clearly show that I am the legal owner of this vehicle. I purchased it from the downtown dealership last weekend. You're welcome to contact them to verify." The second officer had begun circling the car, his flashlight beam scanning every inch of the pristine silver paint. "These models have been reported stolen 3 times this month," he called out, as if that somehow justified their continued suspicion despite the valid documentation in their hands. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk across the street. The judge could see people holding up their phones, recording the encounter. In another time, this might have bothered him. Being seen in such a position, his authority seemingly stripped away. But now, he felt oddly grateful for those witnesses and their cameras. "Step back to my patrol car," the first officer instructed, still holding the judge's license and registration. "We need to run some additional checks." The judge complied, knowing every step of this dance, understanding that each movement was being watched not just by the growing crowd, but by history itself. As they walked, the judge's judicial badge caught the glare of the streetlight. The second officer noticed it first, his flashlight beam suddenly fixed on the golden shield. There was a moment of hesitation, a subtle shift in the air. "Sir, are you?" The officer's voice trailed off as recognition began to dawn. The judge could almost see the mental calculations happening behind the officer's eyes. The realization that they had just spent the last 15 minutes treating a federal judge like a common car thief. "Yes, officer," the judge replied quietly, not with triumph or anger, but with the same steady dignity he'd maintained throughout the encounter. "I'm a federal judge in the district court. I was heading home from chambers when you stopped me." The change in the officer's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The flashlights lowered, the tense postures relaxed, and the authoritative tone dissolved into something approaching embarrassment. The first officer quickly handed back the license and registration, his hands slightly less steady than before. "Your Honor, we had no idea," the officer stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area, and we were just following protocol." The judge looked at the young officers, seeing not just their badges and uniforms, but the larger system they represented, a system he had devoted his life to improving. He thought about all the other people who had stood where he was standing, who didn't have a judge's badge to change the tone of the encounter. "Protocol," the judge repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "Let's talk about protocol." His voice wasn't angry or accusatory, but carried the weight of someone who had seen both sides of the justice system. "But not here, not now. I think we all need to have a longer conversation about what happened tonight, don't you?" The gathered crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording. The judge knew that tomorrow, this scene would probably be all over social media. His colleagues would see it, his daughter would see it, and most importantly, his community would see it. The question wasn't just about what had happened here tonight. It was about what would happen next. As the officers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, the judge made another decision. This encounter wouldn't end with just a dismissal or an awkward apology. It would become something more, a teaching moment, a catalyst for change, a story that needed to be told. News travels fast in a digital age. By the time the judge arrived at his chambers the next morning, his phone was already buzzing with messages and missed calls. The video of last night's encounter had spread across social media like wildfire, capturing the attention of local news stations and community leaders. The familiar weight of his robe felt different that morning as he prepared for court. Through his office window, he could see news vans gathering outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching up like metal trees against the morning sky. His assistant had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters seeking comments about the incident. As he sat at his desk, a knock on his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. The chief of police had requested an immediate meeting. The judge glanced at his morning docket, then at the clock on the wall that had witnessed thousands of legal decisions. This, he realized, was just as important as any case he'd hear today. The chief entered, his posture a mix of official authority and obvious discomfort. "Your Honor," he began, taking the offered seat across from the judge's desk. "I want to personally apologize for last night's incident. The officers involved have been placed on administrative duty pending a full investigation." The judge raised his hand gently, the same gesture he used in court to pause overeager attorneys. "Chief," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, This isn't about disciplinary action. This is about something much bigger than those two officers or even that one traffic stop. He stood up and walked to his window, watching the growing media presence below. Do you know what I was thinking about during that stop? He continued, his reflection clear in the glass. I was thinking about every case I've heard involving similar situations. About every person who stood in my courtroom describing the same experience. The only difference is I had a badge that changed the outcome. The chief shifted in his chair, his usual confidence wavering under the judge's measured words. We've implemented bias training programs, he offered, but even he seemed to recognize how inadequate that sounded in the moment. Training is important, the judge acknowledged, turning back to face the chief. But what happened last night wasn't just about training. It was about assumptions. About seeing a black man in a luxury car and immediately jumping to conclusions. About treating every explanation with suspicion until a badge forced a different perspective. He picked up one of the many law books lining his shelves, its pages marked with countless tabs from years of reference. In this room, I make decisions that affect people's lives. I have to look at evidence, at facts, not at assumptions or prejudices. Shouldn't we expect the same on our streets? The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown larger. The judge could hear the distant murmur of their voices, all wanting to know how a federal judge could be mistaken for a car thief. Here's what we're going to do, the judge said, his tone shifting from philosophical to practical. I'm not interested in punishments or public apologies. I want something constructive to come from this. I want to turn this incident into an opportunity for real change. He pulled out a legal pad and began writing, his pen moving with the same purpose he used when drafting important opinions. We're going to organize a series of community forums. Not press conferences, not formal hearings, but real conversations between law enforcement and the community. And I'm going to share my experience, not as a judge, but as a citizen who happened to have a badge that saved him from what could have been a very different outcome. The chief watched as the judge outlined his plan, realizing that this meeting wasn't going the way he had expected. Instead of damage control, they were plotting a path forward. The judge's words weren't angry or accusatory, but they carried an unmistakable urgency. As the meeting concluded, both men stood, understanding that what had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was transforming into something more significant. The incident wasn't just going to be another viral video or news headline. It was becoming a catalyst for the kind of change that couldn't be achieved through policy manuals alone. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filled every available seat. The judge stood at the back of the room, observing the mix of faces: police officers in uniform, community members in everyday clothes, local leaders in business suits, and even some of his courthouse colleagues. The two officers from that night sat in the front row, their posture stiff with discomfort. Camera crews huddled in the corners, their lenses focused on the empty podium. This wasn't a typical press conference or town hall meeting. Tonight was different. Tonight was about truth-telling, about turning one painful incident into a bridge of understanding. As the judge walked toward the podium, he felt the weight of every step. His daughter sat in the audience, her law school textbooks on her lap. She had called him in tears after seeing the viral video, but his response had surprised her. "Watch what happens next," he had told her. Sometimes the most important lessons in law don't come from books. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying the same authority it held in his courtroom, but softened with something more personal. "I'm not here tonight as a judge. I'm here as a member of this community who happened to experience something that too many others have faced without the protection of a judicial badge." The room fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. "Last week, I was stopped while driving my new car. Before anyone knew I was a judge, I was treated like a suspect. My valid registration was questioned. My legitimate ownership was doubted. My very presence in that vehicle was seen as suspicious." He paused, letting the words sink in. But this isn't about just one traffic stop or two officers or even one judge in a Mercedes. He gestured to a screen behind him, where statistics began to appear. Numbers that told a story of disproportionate stops, searches, and arrests. These aren't just numbers, he continued. Each one represents a real person, a real family, a real experience that chips away at trust between law enforcement and the community they serve. The two officers shifted in their seats as the judge described that night from his perspective. Not with anger or accusation, but with the careful detail of someone used to examining evidence. He described the feel of the night air, the glare of flashlights, the gathering crowd with their phone cameras, and most importantly, the moment when his judicial badge changed everything. That badge shouldn't have been necessary, he said firmly. Respect and proper procedure shouldn't depend on someone's title or position. They should be standard for everyone, regardless of what car they drive or what credentials they carry. From his podium, he could see heads nodding in the audience. Some people were wiping away tears. Others were furiously taking notes. The police chief sat with his command staff, their expressions thoughtful and concerned. But here's the opportunity, the judge continued, his voice taking on a note of hope. We can use this incident as a turning point. Not for finger-pointing or blame, but for honest conversation and real change. He unveiled his proposal: a new community oversight committee, regular forums between police and residents, revised training procedures, and most importantly, a commitment to tracking and publicly reporting traffic stop data. Transparency, he emphasized, is the foundation of trust. The two officers who had stopped him were invited to speak next. Their words were halting at first, but grew more confident as they shared their own perspectives and acknowledged their assumptions. The judge watched as the audience listened, not with judgment, but with growing understanding. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. People began sharing their own stories, both civilians and police officers. The atmosphere shifted from tension to dialogue. Even the news cameras seemed to capture the change, focusing less on conflict and more on connection. The judge's daughter watched it all, her law books forgotten in her lap. She was seeing something that no textbook could teach: how justice sometimes happens not in courtrooms, but in community centers, through difficult conversations and brave admissions. The police department's training room looked different today. Instead of the usual rows of chairs facing a projector screen, the space had been arranged in a circle. The judge sat among a mixed group of police officers and community members, his judicial robes left behind in his chambers. Today wasn't about authority. It was about honest conversation. The training session began with a dashcam video from that night, playing on the large screen. The judge watched the officers' faces as they viewed their colleagues' interaction with him. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others took notes, and a few nodded in recognition of familiar patterns they'd seen, or perhaps displayed, themselves. Let's pause here, the judge suggested as the video showed the moment his judicial badge was discovered. What do we notice about how the tone of this encounter changed? His question hung in the air, not accusatory, but inviting reflection. A younger officer raised his hand. The body language completely shifted, he observed. We went from suspicious and defensive to apologetic, all because of a badge. His voice carried a note of realization that seemed to resonate through the room. The department's internal affairs records were spread out on tables around the room: statistics, complaint reports, and traffic stop data. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. Certain neighborhoods saw higher stop rates, certain demographics faced more scrutiny, certain assumptions seemed to guide too many interactions. When I was stopped that night, the judge shared, leaning forward in his chair, I had just finished a day of hearing cases. One of them involved a young man who was arrested after a similar traffic stop escalated. The difference was, he didn't have a badge to change the dynamic. He didn't have the benefit of 20 years of legal experience to help him navigate the situation. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. A veteran officer spoke up, his voice carrying years of street experience. We're trained to look for suspicious behavior, to trust our instincts, he explained. But maybe sometimes what we call instinct is really something else. The judge nodded, remembering the countless times he'd heard similar justifications in his courtroom. Let's talk about that, he suggested. What makes a new car suspicious? What makes a well-dressed person suspicious? What makes anyone suspicious? The discussion that followed was raw and honest. Officers shared their fears and frustrations, the split-second decisions they had to make, the dangers they faced, the pressure to be both protective and perfect. Community members spoke about their own fears, of being stopped, of being judged, of having their legitimate presence in their own neighborhoods questioned. As the afternoon progressed, the group role-played different scenarios. The judge watched as officers tried handling routine stops differently, practicing new approaches that focused on respect and clear communication rather than immediate suspicion. The two officers from that night led some of these exercises, their experience serving as both a warning and a teaching tool. One particularly powerful moment came when an older officer shared a story about his own son being profiled while driving. I never thought about it from the other side until it happened to my boy, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Now I can't help but think about it every time I make a stop. The judge's phone buzzed with a message from his daughter. She had just finished her first law school class on constitutional rights. "Thinking of you, Dad," she wrote. "What happened to you is literally in our textbook now." He smiled, knowing that real change often started in moments like these, in training rooms and classrooms where difficult truths could be faced and addressed. As the session wound down, the police chief announced new departmental policies. Body cameras would now activate automatically at traffic stops. Regular community feedback sessions would become mandatory, and stop data would be reviewed monthly for patterns of bias. These weren't just reactive measures, they were proactive steps toward rebuilding trust. The judge looked around the room one last time before leaving. What he saw gave him hope. Officers and community members exchanging contact information, making plans for future discussions, breaking down the invisible walls that had separated them for too long. 2 months after the incident, the judge sat in his study at home, reviewing dozens of letters spread across his desk. Each envelope told a story, some handwritten, others typed, all sharing personal experiences sparked by his viral traffic stop video. The evening light filtered through his window as he carefully read each one. One letter came from a high school teacher who used the incident as a classroom discussion topic. Her students had engaged in deep conversations about justice, assumptions, and the power of position in society. Another was from a retired police officer who admitted the video had made him reflect on his own past actions during traffic stops. His doorbell rang, interrupting his reading. Outside stood one of the officers from that night, the younger one who had first noticed his judicial badge. The officer had asked for this meeting, away from the formal setting of the courthouse or police station. In his hands, he held a thick folder. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," the officer said as they settled in the judge's living room. The formality of the courthouse was gone, replaced by the simple humanity of two people trying to bridge a gap. "I've been doing some research since that night." The officer opened his folder, revealing pages of his own traffic stop records from the past 3 years. He had analyzed every stop, every interaction, looking for patterns he'd never noticed before. "I found something I'm not proud of," he admitted, his voice steady but humbled. The numbers were clear. His stops had shown clear bias patterns. But what impressed the judge wasn't just the admission. It was the officer's next words. "I've started sharing these findings with my fellow officers. Some of them are now doing their own analysis." As they talked, the judge's phone buzzed with an email. His daughter had sent him a link to her law school paper, an analysis of how social media and viral videos were changing the landscape of police accountability. Her professor had given her top marks, noting how she'd woven her father's experience into a broader discussion of justice reform. The conversation with the officer turned to changes already happening in the department. Body camera footage was now regularly reviewed, not just for violations, but for teaching moments. Traffic stop data was being publicly shared monthly. The Community Oversight Committee was active and engaged. Last week, the officer shared, I stopped another luxury car. Everything in my old training said it was suspicious. But before I approached, I remembered that night with you. Instead of assuming the worst, I approached with respect. Turned out it was a surgeon heading home from an emergency shift. The judge nodded, understanding the significance of this small but crucial shift in perspective. He showed the officer some of the letters on his desk. Stories of similar experiences from across the country. Your willingness to learn and change, the judge said, that's as important as any policy reform. They moved to the judge's kitchen for coffee, the conversation flowing more easily now. The officer shared how his own family had reacted to the incident. His mother's disappointment, his sister's tears, his father's quiet suggestion that maybe this was a wake-up call. These personal impacts, the judge realized, were where real change often began. As evening settled in, they discussed the upcoming community forum. The officer had volunteered to speak, to share his journey from that night to now. It's not comfortable, he admitted, standing up there and talking about your mistakes. But if it helps other officers think differently, it's worth it. The judge's daughter called during their conversation. She was preparing for a mock trial competition, and her case involved police procedure. The judge put her on speaker, letting her join the discussion. Her fresh perspective from law school, mixed with the officer's real-world experience, created a powerful dialogue. Before the officer left, he paused at the door. You know, Your Honor, that night could have gone very differently. You could have used your position to punish us, to demand our badges. Instead, you turned it into something that's changing lives. The judge watched from his window as the officer drove away, noticing how the streetlights cast long shadows across his driveway. The same lights that had illuminated a tense traffic stop 2 months ago now lit the way for something more hopeful. Proof that even difficult moments could become stepping stones toward understanding. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The judge stood in the police academy's main hall, watching as a new class of recruits filed in for their morning training. His presence here wasn't by chance. He had been invited to help reshape the academy's training program, turning his experience into a teaching moment for future officers. The room was filled with young faces, all eager to begin their careers in law enforcement. On the walls hung new posters about community policing and bias awareness, replacing the old ones that had focused solely on tactical training. The change wasn't just cosmetic. It represented a shift in how the department approached its fundamental mission. Today, the judge began, setting aside his prepared notes. We're going to talk about something that won't be on your final exam, but might be the most important lesson of your career. He picked up a remote and played the now familiar video of his traffic stop. The recruits watched intently, some taking notes, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A young recruit raised her hand. Sir, what were you thinking during those moments before they recognized you as a judge? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The judge appreciated its directness. It went straight to the heart of the matter. I was thinking about my daughter, he answered honestly. I was thinking about how I taught her to handle traffic stops. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, move slowly. But I was also thinking about how unfair it was that these instructions were necessary at all. The training session evolved into a frank discussion. The judge shared stories from his courtroom, cases where simple misunderstandings had escalated into life-changing confrontations. But he also shared positive examples, instances where officers had diffused tension through respect and clear communication. During a break, one of the recruits approached him privately. My father owns a successful business, the young man shared, but he still gets pulled over regularly in our neighborhood. I joined the force hoping to change things from the inside. The judge nodded, understanding the weight of carrying such dual perspectives. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. The judge worked with the academy instructors to create realistic situations that challenged assumptions. They role-played traffic stops where the drivers didn't fit stereotypical expectations. Successful professionals in luxury cars, elderly residents in new vehicles, young people and their parents' expensive cars. Your instincts are important, the judge explained, but they need to be based on actual suspicious behavior, not unconscious bias. He showed them department data from the past 6 months, how changes in approach had led to more positive community interactions and more effective law enforcement. The 2 officers from his traffic stop, now involved in training themselves, joined the session. They shared their own journey of realization and change. The recruits listened intently as their future colleagues described how the incident had transformed their approach to policing. During the practical exercises, the judge noticed something remarkable. The recruits were asking different questions than he'd heard in previous academy classes. Instead of focusing solely on officer safety and tactical concerns, they were considering community impact, communication strategies, and ways to build trust. Near the end of the day, a discussion broke out about the challenges they would face on the streets. How do we balance safety with respect? One recruit asked. How do we maintain authority while building trust? The questions showed a deeper understanding of their future role than the judge had expected. The judge shared a final story about a recent traffic stop he'd witnessed from his chamber's window. He'd watched as an officer approached a luxury car with respect rather than suspicion, how the interaction had remained professional and dignified throughout. That officer, he revealed, was one of the ones who stopped me that night. Change is possible. It starts with awareness and continues with action. As the session ended, the academy director announced new additions to the curriculum: regular community interaction sessions, implicit bias training, and ongoing cultural competency courses. These weren't just optional seminars anymore. They were core requirements for graduation. The judge watched the recruits file out, their conversations animated with new perspectives and ideas. In their faces, he saw the future of law enforcement, one that could balance protection with respect, authority with understanding. 1 year had passed. The judge parked his Mercedes in front of the community center where it all began. The same car that had sparked a confrontation had now become a symbol of change. As he stepped out, he noticed how different things felt. Police officers and community members greeted each other by name, their interactions marked by genuine warmth rather than tension. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Tables displayed charts showing a year's worth of data, traffic stop statistics, complaint records, and most importantly, signs of progress. The numbers told a story of transformation: reduced bias incidents, increased community trust, and more positive interactions between police and residents. His daughter, now in her 2nd year of law school, stood at one of the presentation boards. She was explaining to a group of high school students how one incident had created ripples of change across the entire justice system. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had watched theory transform into practice. A year ago, the judge began his address to the gathered crowd. I stood in this room as someone who had experienced what too many others had faced. Today, I stand here as a witness to what can happen when we turn a difficult moment into an opportunity for change. The changes were visible everywhere. Body cameras had become standard practice, with footage regularly reviewed not just for problems, but for examples of positive community interaction. The department's weekly community meetings had evolved from tense confrontations into collaborative problem-solving sessions. A young officer, a recent graduate from that reformed academy class, shared her story. Last month, she said, I stopped a luxury car in an area known for auto theft. But instead of approaching with suspicion, I remembered our training. The driver turned out to be a city council member, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I treated them with respect from the start. The 2 officers from that fateful night sat in the audience. They had become advocates for change within the department, their experience serving as a powerful teaching tool. The younger officer now led implicit bias training sessions, while the senior officer mentored new recruits on community-oriented policing. During the break, the judge walked through the exhibition area. Photos showed community police barbecues, joint volunteer projects, and youth mentoring programs. These weren't just photo ops. They were signs of genuine relationship building between law enforcement and the community they served. His phone buzzed with a message from another judge in a different state, asking for advice on implementing similar reforms in their jurisdiction. The story had spread, inspiring changes far beyond their city limits. Other departments had begun sending observers to learn from their experience. The chief of police took the podium next, announcing new initiatives. A citizen advisory board with real oversight power, expanded community policing programs, and a scholarship fund for minority students interested in law enforcement careers. These weren't just policies, they were investments in the future. As the event wound down, the judge noticed a small group gathered around his car in the parking lot. It was a teaching moment in progress. An officer explaining to some teenagers how that traffic stop had changed not just procedures, but perspectives. The car had become more than transportation. It was a rolling reminder of how far they'd come. His daughter joined him outside, law books under her arm. "Dad," she said, "my professor used your case to teach us about systemic change. He said sometimes the most powerful legal precedents aren't set in courtrooms." The judge smiled, understanding that the real verdict on that night's events was still being written in the daily interactions between police and community. Before leaving, the judge watched as officers and residents mingled in the parking lot, sharing stories and making plans for future projects. The barriers that had once seemed so solid had begun to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding. As he drove home that evening, a police car pulled up beside him at a red light. The officer smiled and waved, not out of recognition or fear, but as one member of the community acknowledging another. In that simple gesture, the judge saw the future they had been working toward, a place where respect came before assumptions, and badges signified service rather than power.